There is one more biogeochemical cycle that the learning objectives say we need to talk about, and this one's actually a good deal simpler than some of the other ones we've talked about, and it's the sulfur cycle. Sulfur, like the other nutrients that we've talked about, is an important component of biological systems. Sulfur, in particular, is used in certain amino acids, and amino acids are the building blocks of proteins, and proteins are 50% of the dry weight of all cells and organic material, so it's a pretty important piece of the puzzle. The sulfur cycle does have an atmospheric component, like most of the other biogeochemical cycles do, the only exception being the phosphorus cycle, which has no atmospheric component. And the steps of the sulfur cycle go like this. Sulfur compounds are released into the atmosphere from volcanoes, from fires, from wetland decomposers, and from other sources. Fire is a combustion reaction. We talked a little bit about how combustion is similar to cellular respiration. We also talked about how decomposition is related to cellular respiration. So decomposition and fire both have this feature of releasing sulfur-based compounds into the atmosphere. Any kind of burning of fuel is going to release sulfur into the atmosphere. The most natural version of that would be, say, forest fires releasing it into the atmosphere, but also burning of fossil fuels is going to release a large amount of sulfur into the atmosphere. Where it says wetland decomposers, think swamp gas. Swamp gas releases a lot of sulfury compounds in the atmosphere, which is often why swamps don't have a particularly great smell. They have that kind of rotten egg smell that you associate with them. Once sulfur dioxide ends up in the atmosphere, it can mix with other compounds like water in the atmosphere, and it can become sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid then lowers the pH of rainwater, and it can return down to the ground as acid rain. Some sulfur compounds in rainwater is normal, and this is part of the natural sulfur cycle. Too much, an overwhelming amount of sulfuric acid in rain is going to be a bad thing. So plants can then absorb sulfur compounds through their roots and incorporate it as a component of their proteins, as I mentioned before. There are a couple of amino acids that utilize sulfur as part of their structure. Those plants can grow up into large forests, and if we have another forest fire come through, then that sulfur can return to the atmosphere in the form of sulfur dioxide, which then turns into sulfuric acid, which then returns in the form of acid precipitation, which then can be taken back up by plants' roots and then turned back into biomass, which then can be burned again, and the cycle continues. In terms of the volcanoes, sometimes the sulfur ends up in the soil, and much like in the phosphorus cycle, occasionally it will be washed out of the soil and end up in streams and lakes and rivers, and eventually washed into the ocean, get deposited on the ocean floor, and through geological processes eventually can end up back in a volcano or a volcanically active area where it can be released into the atmosphere through that method. Now, of course, every biogeochemical cycle that we've discussed has this component to it. Once it is taken up by the producers, plants and algae and blue-green bacteria, those organisms can be eaten by primary consumers, and then primary consumers can be eaten by secondary consumers. They create waste and detritus, which then can be returned to the soil through the decomposers, and then the nutrients in the soil can be pulled back up by the producers, which creates a loop within the loop. Every biogeochemical cycle we've discussed has included the food chain as a subsection of it. But it's important to remember the general scheme of biogeochemical cycling that we started with several videos ago. Remember that this is the process by which nutrients and elements and atoms move from the living realm to the non-living realm, from the atmosphere to the biosphere to the hydrosphere to the lithosphere. So you can actually see in all of these different charts how these elements are moving from place to place to place in each of these ecosystems. And because these are all closed loops, they're constantly cycling round and round and round. It's important that they're cycles because that prevents the elements and nutrients that we're talking about, sulfur and carbon and nitrogen and water and phosphorus, from being concentrated in just one location. The massive scale of these cycles allows not only chemicals to be cycled within ecosystems, but between very distantly connected ecosystems, such that sulfur is available to every ecosystem on the planet, even if they're nowhere near a volcano or an active wildfire. So you can see how having a component that returns these materials back to the atmosphere allows them to spread and mix and get to all of the various locations across the planet. And that's not just for the sulfur cycle, that goes for all the biogeochemical cycles we've discussed. Even the phosphorus cycle, which doesn't have an atmospheric component, it utilizes long-term geological processes in order to distribute nutrients across the planet, in much the same way the sulfur cycle is using here, where it's allowing sulfur to return to the ocean floor sometimes, and then it can return through volcanic activity. So the portion of each of these biogeochemical cycles where we have the producers and the consumers and the detritivores, that's the biosphere, the living portion of the biogeochemical cycles. The hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the lithosphere are the abiotic reservoirs that the biosphere makes exchanges with for these nutrients. Now on this chart it has some red arrows as well, and the red arrows are human activities. A lot of the sulfur in the atmosphere is actually as a result of human activities, not as a result of natural processes. So burning coal actually adds a lot of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, as well as the process of refining fossil fuels like converting crude oil into gasoline and other petroleum products. Smelting ore also releases a lot of sulfur dioxide. Smelting is the process of taking chunks of rock that you got from inside of a mine and getting the metal out of the rock in order to be able to work with that metal as a material. So all three of these human activities increase the amount of sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere, which then increases the amount of sulfuric acid returning to the earth through precipitation, which decreases the overall pH of rainwater, meaning that the rain can actually damage plant leaves when it lands on them. It's acid rain coming down. And as I've mentioned when we talked about the nitrogen cycle, acid rain can end up impairing photosynthesis, which limits how much energy the producers can actually get for the ecosystem. And since all of the energy for the ecosystem comes from the plants, that limits how much overall growth and how much overall health the ecosystem can ultimately have. If you've ever seen plants that are affected from acid rain, sometimes they have little holes in them. Usually they turn yellow and they're kind of wrinkly. You can just tell that the ecosystem is suffering. On the next slide, I have a picture of the smelting process. This is getting the liquid metal ore out through a foundry, just to give you more of a visual representation of what that is. And I say we release sulfur in three ways. We burn sulfur-containing oil and coal. So any kind of fossil fuel burning also releases sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. We refine sulfur-containing oil to make gasoline and heating oil, etc. That refining process also just by itself, even without burning the products, releases sulfur dioxide. And we also extract metals such as copper and zinc from sulfur-containing compounds in rock ore. Additionally, I mentioned that forest fires will release sulfur compounds into the atmosphere, and sometimes humans intentionally start forest fires. For example, down in the rainforest, people will set fire to large sections of the forest in order to clear the land for either cattle grazing territory or for palm oil plantations. This not only releases a lot of sulfur, but also carbon dioxide and methane, in addition to reducing the overall amount of photosynthesis that could potentially pull that carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere, destroying large sections of natural habitat and reducing the biodiversity of the area. In this class, you periodically have to do current event assignments for homework. If you're interested in any of those things I just mentioned, the destruction of the rainforest is usually something you can find a good article about in its underlying causes, so it might be something worth looking into. Now, the good news is that actually through regulation, we have dramatically reduced the amount of sulfur dioxide that we are dumping into the atmosphere. So Compared to what we were doing in the 90s and early 2000s, we are putting substantially less sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere than we used to. We are still pumping it out, but this is one of the few environmental cases where we're actually doing a much better job. For right now, we're really just concentrating on the biogeochemical cycles and the ways that humans influence them. We'll talk more in detail about the specific policies and the methods of control we have for limiting how much sulfur dioxide goes into the atmosphere when we get into the air pollution section. Since the steps of the sulfur cycle were relatively short, I'm going to use the second part of this video to talk more generally about soil and soil formation. So, soil is a slowly renewable resource that provides nutrients needed for plant growth and helps purify water. Obviously, in every biogeochemical cycle that we've talked about, there was a step where we mentioned that the nutrients became available to the producers of the ecosystem through the soil. So, plants, the producers, also algae and some types of bacteria, are able to take up inorganic nutrients from the soil, phosphorus, nitrogen, sulfur, all kinds of things, and pull them up and utilize them. So the soil is one of the resources, one of the reservoirs where we have these nutrients, and it's part of the lithosphere. Here where it says it purifies water, if there's any kind of pollutant inside water, as it trickles through the various layers of soil, those pollutants can be kind of filtered away and changed through chemical reactions, and when it eventually gets down to the groundwater, it's much purer water than any kind of polluted surface water that you may have had otherwise. Sometimes pollutants can get down into the groundwater, but typically the effect of soil is that, and the various soil layers, is that they help to purify that water as it makes it into groundwater. Soil formation begins when bedrock is broken down by physical and chemical and biological processes, which we refer to as weathering, and we talked about weathering in the video where we discussed the phosphorus cycle. That's where you start out with just rock, just solid rock, but slowly as water trickles over it, as rainwater dissolves away little bits of that rock, as the acidic quality of the water interacts with it and breaks it into little pieces, as freezing and thawing cycles, winter and summer, go through, and the ice expands and melts, and it gets into little cracks between the rocks and slowly wedges them further and further apart, making the cracks bigger and bigger. The rocks get broken into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces. So you can go from having barren rock into having little tiny pieces of rock, and all the nutrients can kind of be unlocked through this process. So instead of having one big solid chunk of rock, you can have things like gravel, and then even smaller you would get things like sand. Sand is just really tiny bits of rock kind of mixed together. And then if it gets even smaller, you're talking about things like silt and clay, so very tiny particles of these materials. Now, the place where the most weathering is going to have happened is going to be on the topmost layers, and then the bedrock is going to be down at the bottom. It makes sense that you're going to get the most interaction with the weather and the elements up at the top, and then as you get further down in layers, you're going to have less interaction with water and the freezing and thawing cycles and things like that. So you'll get smaller particles of material up top and more solid, larger chunks of material down at the bottom. But just having sand or silt or clay or something like that up at the top doesn't give you nice soil that's available for being able to grow plants or grow an ecosystem. You would need organic material mixed in there as well. So that means that we need some biological components to start being added in. And we mentioned a couple of them in the phosphorus video too. There are these organisms or composite organisms called lichens, which are a mixture of algae and fungus. And they're able to grow on barren rock and get some nutrients out of that barren rock. And through biological processes, they actually increase the rate of weathering. So they accelerate this process. But when they die, they leave their bodies behind and they decay and they add some organic material into this mixture of very tiny particles of rock. So you start to get a little bit more organic material, a little bit more biological material mixed in there, and it becomes a little bit more like that topsoil that we're familiar with in forests. Now, once enough of a layer of that dirt can build up, you can get slightly larger plants to start setting up shop. So you can get mosses to start establishing themselves. They don't need much soil established whatsoever. They can basically grow on barren rock as well. And then they leave their bodies behind and they build up a little bit more of that organic material. And slowly but surely you get a little bit of a thin layer of actual dirt where there used to be just barren rock. And there you can get grasses starting to show up and annuals starting to show up. Annuals are plants that complete their entire life cycle in a single year. So these are relatively simple plants, but you can see that we've moved from lichens over to mosses to grasses and other types of annuals. And slowly as this soil layer starts to build up, and we're getting more and more detritus building up in that soil layer, we are getting a thicker and thicker layer of nutrient material that is ready for larger plants to put down their roots, and you can get biennials starting to show up. Plants that take 2 years to complete their life cycle. And then eventually you can get perennials, things that are there year to year to year to year. So you can start to get shrubs going in there. And eventually there's enough soil for maybe trees to start putting down their roots. So you can see this progression of weathering, which is a physical and chemical and biological process, converting barren rock over to a number of soil layers with the richest amount of organic material up at the top, and then slightly less organic material just below that, just really fine bits of sand and silt and clay, and then a little bit rockier just below that, and bedrock below that. So you have this series of soil layers, which we refer to as soil horizons, arranged below the surface. And as they continue to develop and develop and develop, they become more mature and they support more and more complicated ecosystems on top of them. While this whole process is occurring, all of those biogeochemical cycles that we've discussed are occurring at the same time. The phosphorus cycle is participating in this. Remember, that has to do with the weathering of the rocks and the delivery of phosphate ions down into floodplains below. The nitrogen cycle is occurring with these nitrogen-fixing bacteria that now live in this thin layer of soil. They are unlocking the nitrogen from the atmosphere and they're delivering it to these plant roots, which is allowing them to be able to grow up. The carbon cycle is occurring. As the plants grow, they do photosynthesis, they're able to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and as the plant life continues to develop, now animal life can start moving in as well, so you get producers and consumers in these developing ecosystems. So you can see the slow development of mature soils over time is intensely connected to the development of the ecosystem of that area over time. Mature soils are going to be arranged in horizontal layers, which we refer to as soil horizons. And if you dig a hole down in the earth, and it's deep enough, you can actually see by changes in color the various soil horizons. You'll see like a dark layer followed by a light colored layer, followed by another dark layer, followed by a change to like a light brown layer. You'll be able to see a dedicated color difference for each one of these different soil horizons. On the next slide, I have an image of exactly that. Someone's dug a hole down and you can clearly see the various soil horizons, and we've also labeled them for convenience. So the very top layer of soil is referred to as the O horizon, and this is the leaf litter. This isn't actually soil proper. This is just the layer of detritus sitting on top. So it's all the dead, undecomposed material from any ecosystem, say you're in a forest, that you'd see sitting on top of the soil. So if you walk around any forest in Pennsylvania, you're going to see a whole bunch of leaves from the previous fall just kind of sitting on the ground. That's the leaf litter layer. That's the O horizon, the organic horizon of the soil. The layer right under that is the topsoil, which we refer to as the A horizon. The topsoil is a rich, nutrient-dense loam. A loam is that nice dark soil that farmers use in order to plant crops, that if you want to do gardening. It's that really good soil that you would want to get into your garden beds. And this is going to be one of the top layers of soil in any kind of, like, say, forested ecosystem. And it has a high amount of organic content in it because it's right up at the top. This is where all of the decomposed organic matter is sitting. The leaf litter on top is all the undecomposed material, but as it's decomposed and it's broken down, it moves into this layer right below the A horizon, the topsoil. Topsoil is actually a very slowly renewable resource that is another one that humans overuse a little bit. We harvest it at a rate that is faster than ecosystems can naturally produce it. So this is another example of over-harvesting. But for right now, we're just going to talk about the various soil horizons. The zone right below that is relatively nutrient poor. This is because the particles of rock that have occurred from weathering aren't as broken down as in the higher layers, so it's closer to sand in texture. And this allows water to flow through this zone a lot more easily. The more space there is between particles and the larger the particles are, the easier water has a time moving through that soil. If you have some very tiny particles, that's closer to something like clay, and clay is something that water has a hard time moving through, but sand, water can move through relatively fast. This horizon is referred to as the E horizon or alluviation zone, and it does not show up in all soil profiles. Alluviation is a term that refers to the movement of liquid through materials in a dissolved way. So this refers to a zone of rapid water movement. But the reason why this one is grayed out a little bit is because it won't show up in absolutely every soil profile that you see. The B and C horizons are called the subsoil and parent material, and they contain most of the inorganic material of any kind of soil, which is carried down through the alluviation zone through water. And this contains a lot more just particles of, say, sand and silt and clay, and not a lot of organic matter. There's not going to be any organic matter all the way down here. And then below that is just going to be the bedrock. So when you get down here in these lower layers, you're mostly dealing with rock in various stages of being broken down. But in the upper layer, the O and A horizon, that's where you have all of the actual organic matter available. Now, the A horizon and the O horizon, they both have a lot of air mixed up in them. They're these nice airy soils, which we refer to as loam, and also very nutrient rich. And you would think a loose soil like that would be very easy to just kind of wash away. But the effect of plant roots is that it holds the soil together. So as long as the ecosystem is healthy and the plant roots are dug down deep into the soil, it's going to hold that topsoil together. So you have, again, this interaction between the biosphere and the lithosphere holding each other together. Now there's a couple of vocabulary words that you guys need to learn. One is percolation. Percolation is the passage of a liquid through the spaces of a porous material such as soil. There's another situation where we use the term percolation, and maybe this will help to remember its definition. A coffee percolator, right? You percolate coffee. And how do you make coffee? You allow hot water to drip through the coffee grounds, which is a broken up little bit of particles of material and dark material, kind of like soil, and the water drips through the spaces in between those coffee grounds and eventually ends up in that coffee pot. So just like we have a coffee percolator, percolation is the passage of the liquid between the porous spaces of the soil particles, the sand, the silt, and the clay, and all of that. So that's percolation. The next bit of vocabulary is on the following slide. Soil porosity. Different layers of the soil, different soil horizons are going to have different soil porosity, but also different ecosystems are going to have different soils, and they too will have different soil porosity. And that's the amount of space or pores between the soil particles. Typically, if you have large soil particles, you're going to have a lot more open space in between them. If you have very tiny particles, like I said, clay, very tiny, then they can be packed together very, very tight, so you're going to have very limited space in between each one of them. So soil porosity, the more space you have in between particles, the more quickly water can move through that space. And then lastly, humus. Humus is a phrase. I know it sounds like a spread that you would put on crackers. Humus is the phrase that describes the slightly soluble residue of undigested or partially decomposed organic material in topsoil. This material helps retain water and water-soluble nutrients which can be taken up by plant roots. So it's this residue, it's this material within the topsoil which plays a role in retaining the nutrients. It's tied up with the organic material of that topsoil. It's called humus.